So sorry about the delay getting set up. Let me start by introducing myself. I'm Damien Tobin. I'm from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, where I lecture mostly on management, a little bit of economics, but never really politics. And I understand you're mostly a politics course. And you're all politics, yeah. So if I say anything that you don't particularly understand, we'll draw on some management theory to look at this topic. We'll draw on some economic theory and a little bit of what I know of politics. So, but if there's anything there you don't understand, stop me straight away and I'll try to explain it as best I can. So what we're going to look at today is this question of reforming China's state-owned enterprises. Okay? And in a way it's a little bit of an old topic in that the reform of China's state-owned enterprises, certainly the market side of it, has been an ongoing issue since the late 1970s. It's come back to prominence again recently because of the publication of this report. It was called the China 2030 report, I think, which was a sort of joint collaboration between the World Bank and the Research Development Council in China. And what it really did was it set out a sort of a fundamental change, a sort of a really radical change to the way state-owned enterprises operated in the economy. So it put forward some really radical suggestions, really sort of putting state-owned enterprise reform on the table again. So that's why I decided to sort of make that the focus of this lecture. It's part of two lectures. Next week, oh sorry, not next week, I think it's the 21st, I'm back here again. And what I'll do then is actually look at some examples of state-owned enterprises and how they've changed. So a more case study approach. So today we'll sort of look at the theory and the policies behind these reforms. Okay. So I'm going to start really by setting out some of the major questions that we'd like to look at. And these are really questions that, again, have been there since the late 1970s. They're not new questions, but they're sort of persistent questions that have dominated the reform of the state sector in China. Okay? So the first one is this really big one of how to overcome the sort of historical legacies. So the historical role that state-owned enterprises have played in China since 1949. Okay? And I'll show you a table in a minute which sort of shows you how they really grew in significance since 1949. So that by 1978 they have a really large share of economic growth, a really large share of urban employment. And in a way, this made it all the more difficult to reform them. So there's very strong historical legacies there. The second question is, in taking such a role in the economy, particularly state enterprises, they ended up with, the state sector generally, ended up with this sort of fourfold role in the economy, where the state was owner of industrial enterprises, it was also regulator, so it set their prices, it set market prices. It was also a prudential supervisor, so it regulated market behavior of the state-owned enterprises. And it also was in charge of procurement. So by procurement we mean the purchase of goods, the allocation of contracts. So across a whole range of market activities, the state was involved. Okay? And when you have this level of involvement in the economy, it's very hard to sort of draw back from one area without it having a knock-on effect on the other. Okay? So if you introduce market incentives into procurement, so if you say, right, we're going to open contracts, the state-owned enterprise contracts to private sector, what does that mean for the state's role as, say, supervisor of market behavior? Or what does it mean for its role in regulator, i.e. setting market prices? The same with owner. If you reform the state's role as owner of state enterprises, so if you do something like privatization, how does that affect its ability to regulate the market? How does it affect its ability to supervise the market behavior of management? Okay? So drawing back from each of these areas has created its own set of different problems. The third area is this question of, how does China see the state enterprises going forward? So they had such a large role in industry. So if if you want to reform that, do you view them as sort of relics of the past and you privatize them quickly, sell off shares and make them behave according to market incentives as quickly as possible? Or do you take an alternative approach and say, well, all the experience they've gathered in industry, all the employment they generate, the technology they have, the brands they have established, maybe this is some sort of use in the future. And so a lot has been said about state enterprises as sort of national champions, so champions of Chinese industry, particularly abroad. So if you want to give a little bit of background on this, one of the downsides of economic reforms in China is that it hasn't necessarily led to the creation of well-known Chinese brands abroad. Okay? So a lot of foreign companies are in China, but not so many Chinese companies have high-profile brands abroad. Okay? So one way of overcoming this problem is to say, well, we'll use what we've got. We'll use the state sector as a means to go out and purchase companies in Europe, in America, in Africa. So in a sense, we'll make them national champions. Okay? And there's a lot of sense to that policy. The fourth major question that I'd like to look at is, how do you reform corporate governance and reduce the state's presence in key sectors? And these are kind of related questions in the sense that the corporate governance structure, that is, when we say corporate governance, we mean, in whose interest our enterprise run. So the corporate structure of Chinese state-owned enterprises is obviously heavily dominated by the state. Okay? It's heavily dominated by politics and the Chinese Communist Party. Okay, so they have a very big role in the corporate governance of state enterprises. And secondly, how do you reduce their presence in key sectors? So if you want to grow a private sector, it obviously means that the state has to reduce its presence in certain key sectors. And those key sectors are quite well known, things like telecommunications, oil, petrochemicals, banking, infrastructure, utilities. These are all sectors of the Chinese economy where state enterprises have a very big role. So again, how do you roll back that presence? How do you reduce the presence of state enterprises? Okay. And this final question, which is also dominating a lot of policy discussion at the moment, has government omnipotence in the Chinese economy actually become an obstacle to efficiency? So has the state grown so big, and does it command such a role in the Chinese economy that actually it now represents a serious obstacle to efficiency? Okay. So these are the major questions that we'd like to look at. These questions are part of an ongoing and very long-term reform agenda. So if I take you back a little bit and we go back to Deng Xiaoping in 1978, he predicted essentially that by opening up the economy and by having an open door policy, that the private sector would eventually reach, maybe by 2010, about 10% of the Chinese economy. Okay, it's far exceeded that vision. Okay, so it now accounts for about 60% of the economy. So even Deng Xiaoping's sort of idea of how far the reform process will go has actually gone far further than he would ever have envisaged. In the 1990s, so in the late 1970s, early 1980s, this was the question. So how to build a small private sector, open up state enterprises a little bit more, allow them bring on board foreign capital. In the 1990s, a lot of the reform was more about how do you establish a socialist market economy. So okay, rather than a full market economy, you'll have a socialist market economy. This changed again towards the end of the 1990s with this policy of grasping the large and letting go of the small. So this was the idea of, well, rather than trying to create a socialist market economy where you have a lot of state enterprises, instead you would just have a couple of large state-owned enterprises. and you let go of the small ones. So you privatize them, you sell them off to private investors. In the 2000s, this policy went a little bit further, and a lot of it has been about almost sort of Western ideas of, you know, antitrust, anti-monopoly law, removing basically anti-competitive practices in the sectors that state enterprises offer. So things like removing bottlenecks to competition in energy, utilities and infrastructure. So that has sort of been a very broad overview of the reform agenda. Okay. What the 2030 report has done, in a sense, and it was released last year in 2012, has sort of pushed this agenda one step forward, one step further. And has said what it wants to see by 2030 is a reduction in the contribution of state-owned enterprises in industrial output from about 27% at present to about 20%, or sorry, to about 10% by 2030. So in about 15 years' time, it sees quite a substantial reduction of the role of state enterprises in China's economy. To do this, it has advanced a number of other reforms, and a lot of these again refer to corporate governance issues and market competition. So it wants to see a further separation of ownership and control by removing the appointment of senior management from the political sphere. So in other words, taking the appointment of senior management out of politics. Okay? So up to now, if you look across the large state-owned enterprises, most of their senior management, particularly at board of director level, come from the Chinese Communist Party, or a very strong Chinese Communist Party base. Okay? And a lot of them have worked their way up through the bureaucracy, worked their way up through state enterprise and state industry, and got where they were through political patronage. Okay? So the 2030 report wants to see a much greater separation between the appointment of management and the political system. The idea of separation of ownership and control is very much in line with the sort of what we know as the modern corporation in the UK. So a corporation where ownership and control are two separate issues. Okay? So you can own a corporation, but you might not necessarily control what it does. Okay? So if you take the example of a typical UK public listed company, and you say, well, you can go to the London Stock Exchange in the morning and buy 1,000 shares in it. It means you own maybe a very small percentage of that company, but you have absolutely no control over what it does. The ones who control the direction of the company are largely the management and the directors. Okay? So that's what we mean by separation of ownership and control. And it's a sort of fundamental idea in corporate governance that you have owners on one side and you have management on the others. The owners supply the capital, the managers come up with the strategy. Okay? Why is that such an issue in China? Well, you could say that, if management are appointed via the political system, then ownership and control are not separated. Okay? Ownership and control are essentially the one thing. The state owns and controls. Okay? It also sees public disclosure of accounts and external audits in line with international best practice as another essential sort of ingredient of further reform. So what we mean by public disclosure is essentially greater transparency in terms of accounting practices, in terms of appointments, external audits, in line with international best practices. It also wants to introduce a further level of governance, or an additional level of governance in the corporate governance structure of state enterprises. So it's proposed the establishment of what are called state asset management companies. And these are essentially, in implementing this idea of separating ownership and control, it wants an additional layer between the state and the state enterprises. and these would be called state asset management companies, and these would essentially represent the government as a shareholder. Okay? And in order to depoliticize them even further, it suggests that these would be subject to, industry-specific and publicly announced performance benchmarks. So their benchmarks would be set, the performance criteria that they have to meet, the returns, the profit criteria, the return on investment, all these would be set in public, and they would have to explain them if these were not met. Interestingly, there's a body that's supposed to perform this function already, and this is called the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission. Okay? So this already does this, so you might ask, well, what does an additional layer achieve? Well, the argument is that there's too much of a link at present between the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission and enterprises. In a sense, they're almost one thing. Okay? And what the report envisages is that the State-Owned Assets and Supervision and Administration Commission would essentially be confined to making policy and oversight of how well markets function. Okay? So rather than enforcing the role as the state's function of shareholder, it would essentially be confined to policy and oversight. Okay? So the obvious question again that follows on from that is, well, why not get rid of it completely? Okay? And the answer is it's probably political compromise. Okay? And the final area that it sees major reforms in is basically market access. Okay? So barriers to entry in key sectors such as petroleum, chemicals, electricity distribution, and telecoms will be lowered. Okay? So this goes back to our first point, which is, how do you reduce the contribution in industrial output from 27% to 10%? So it's a big ask, so you really have to open up the markets that state enterprises operate. Okay? So essentially, the first point is really the target. The following points are, how they're going to do it. Okay? Has anybody any questions on that? Is that quite clear? Okay. What I want to do before we get into the background to all of this is really to say, well, how can we view this? What theoretical perspectives can we draw on to make sense of this issue? Okay. The dominant sort of approach to enterprise reform and more generally the corporate governance issue is agency theory. Okay. Has everybody heard of agency theory? Okay. So agency theory in brief is where you have a principal and an agent. Okay. The principal is the sort of the person who monitors or gives something to an agent to do. So the agent is the person who implements. Okay? So it's up to the principal to supervise the agent, okay, to ensure that the agent does something for him. And the argument is that, so if I'm a principal and you're all agents and I ask you to do something, say for 2 weeks' time, I say, you all write a short essay on state enterprise reforms, and but I'm not going to that because I'm coming from London, I've a million things to do there, that I'm not really going to be able to keep a close eye on you. So there's a good chance that 90% of you won't do it. Okay? So that's called sort of the agency cost. Okay? So how much effort should I have to make sure that you guys do your essay for 2 weeks' time? So I could say, right, well, in order to reduce the cost, I would say, make it 10% of your coursework. Or I would say that, in extreme circumstances, anybody that hasn't the essay done can't come to lecture. So in other words, what a principal can do is write some sort of contract with agents to make sure that they fulfill the task. Okay? Because it is quite a simple idea. And the cost of writing those contracts and the cost of making sure that the agents do what the principal wants them to do is essentially the agency cost. Okay? So this is a very useful application for looking at state enterprises, okay? Because you've got the principal, which is the state, and you've got the agents, which are the enterprise management, okay? In a very simplistic model, okay? The fundamental point of the agency theory is that management will not necessarily act in the interests of shareholders or owners. So the owners of the firm or the shareholders of the firm will give management a certain amount of capital to drive the firm forward, to invest, to pay the employees, and management will go off and do something else. They will buy a big car, they will pay themselves high expenses, they will do all these things. They will do everything basically not to maximize profits in the firm, okay? Unless the principal supervises them properly, so unless the owners supervise them properly, okay? So if we apply that to state enterprise reform, we can say that, well, the enterprise owners, the state, have imperfect information regarding the behavior of management, okay? So when the state appoints state enterprise management, they've really limited information about how management will behave in practice, okay? They could be corrupt, they could squander the assets of the state enterprise, they could run off to Hong Kong with them, they could go anywhere, okay? So the costs of these information, what are called information asymmetries, are referred to as agency costs and include the costs of contracting and monitoring. So how do you write a contract? How do you monitor management? Okay, this is the big question. This problem gets a little bit bigger when you look at an economy like China, because agency theory was based on market economies. Okay? In particular, it was based on what we call fully defined property rights, where everybody knows who owns what, okay? And a fully enforceable legal system. So if we have a dispute about the ownership of something, we can go to the legal system and have it resolved, okay? In a transition economy, these issues are not so clear. So what we call this property rights in economics is property rights. So we say the property rights are unclear, and this makes the cost of doing business, or what are called transaction costs. Transaction costs are very similar to agency costs. It makes these costs a little bit higher. Okay? And these can be high because of competing claims over the ownership of an asset. So if something is privatized, different people can say, well, I own that, or I used to own that. So the local government could say, well, we actually own that factory. And the central government says, no, we're the true owners. And the employees say, well, we also invested our labor in this, and we should have some share in it. So often, when you have a privatization policy, who owns what is often very unclear. And the second issue is that you can have multiple principals, okay? I.e. multiple owners. So you can have local government, you can have regulators, you can have central government, you can have the local party branch, you can have all these people who claim to be the principal, okay? So this makes the agency approach quite difficult to apply in practice. Okay. Nevertheless, if we look at agency theory, it says that, the agency costs can be reduced if you do the following. So, open up more areas to market competition, i.e., you let the market, you let competition do the disciplining. So instead of the manager having to monitor the enterprise and the state having to monitor the enterprise, let the market do it. Okay? Provide management with greater incentives through profit retention and decision-making autonomy. Reconfigure ownership via property rights reform. Standardize the relationship between the political system and state-owned enterprise management. And check the agency costs of insider control through retaining control over key managerial appointments. Okay. What's interesting is that if you look at that list of prescriptions, it's almost the same as this, okay? It's very, you know, the ideas behind it are very similar, okay? Okay. The downside of these sort of policies for mitigating agency costs is that you can have things like asset stripping, okay, which is where management essentially walk away with the assets of the firm. So in the process of reconfiguring ownership, when ownership over assets is very uncertain, management might just say, well, we own this, you know, we walk off with the cash and we walk off with the assets. You can also have corruption. So when you have privatization programs, particularly under unclear property rights, you tend to have a lot of corruption. And the final thing is that if you follow the second last recommendation, which is, you know, you opt to check the agency costs of insider control by appointing people who you know, you really narrow the amount, the pool from which you can recruit management, okay? So you say, well, you know, we retain control over key managerial appointments. In practice, that means that you can only appoint people who you know. And in China, for the states, the obvious people they know are the management who have served state enterprises well over the past 3 or 4 decades. So, you know, again, you're talking about recruiting from a very small talent pool of people. Okay? So that's just some of the basic problems with the agency approach. Okay? An alternative way of looking at this is this idea, it's known as the resource-based approach. Okay? So the big idea behind that is actually a firm or an enterprise is not about contracts, it's not about monitoring, it's not about making people do things. It's actually a collection of resources. Okay? So if you look into a large firm, within the firm you can see lots of different talents, you can see lots of different people, there are lots of different skills and that are not necessarily used in one situation that might become very useful in another situation. And the question is, well, you know, how do you use those resources to the maximum? Okay. What resource theory? Resource theory is actually very useful because it's one of the foundations of sort of the modern approach to firm strategy. So if you ever study firm strategy, or if you ever go to business school or do an MBA or something like that, one of the first things you're going to come up against is its resource theory. And one of the key sort of proponents of this was an economist called Edith Penrose. And she actually originally worked at SOAS, where I work. And her idea was, she basically looked at large oil firms during the 1950s and 1960s. And it was very revolutionary then what she did, in the sense that she took a very different approach to firms. She said, well, you know, they're made up of lots of things. They're sort of, you know, they're often greater than the sum of their parts, and we need to explain why this is. Why do large firms keep growing, and why are they able to consistently do so well? And her idea was, well, really, the firm is a pool of resources, and it's organized by this administrative structure. Okay? And continual change in productive services and knowledge within a firm and the external environment presents firms with continually changing productive opportunities. So, rather than just being about contracts, actually firms are about both internal change and external change, and how they adapt to meet these changes. So decentralized organization structures, professional management, government policy, research and development, these all create productive opportunities within large firms. So So on face value, when you look at this, you say, well, looking at state enterprises in China from this perspective is very appealing, okay? Because they've got an administrative structure, they've got lots of different resources, built up from the 1960s and 1970s. They've got all this professional management structure, government policy, so there should be a lot of opportunities there for creativity and productivity. The only downside is that, if you do apply the resource-based perspective, you can say that, well, actually the type of resources that state-owned enterprises might have built up through central planning, there's a sort of a mismatch between them and the sort of skills and resources demanded by a market economy. Okay? So although state-owned enterprises have a lot of talents, a lot of resources, and they should be well able to change the environment in China and internationally, actually some of these resources might not be best suited to a market economy. Okay? So there is a downside to that. The third approach that you might consider is a sort of political economy approach. And political economy is essentially putting political and economic features together. And if you look at the reform of state-owned enterprises from that perspective, you can say that the whole reform process is essentially characterized by a range of contending formulae for economic reform, and each of these has been represented by different political factions. So, in that sense, if you look at the compromises in the reform process, the changes that have happened, even the 2030 report itself, these are all political compromises, in a sense, to keep different political factions happy and to keep the reform process moving forward. I've given you some references in your reading list. One of them is Sollinger. And Sollinger argues that really, if you look at the Chinese reform process, it has been the style of those professing all shades of opinion to overstate claims for any new departure. Basically saying that you get a lot of new departures, but in fact, they're often overstated. They're often designed to gain some sort of political advantage, but really, in the long term, we're still talking about some fundamental issues. And she argues that these fundamental issues are the goals of modernization and improving living standards. That these two goals have not really changed. So you get a lot of efforts to push forward state-owned enterprises, but if you look at Chinese history, you can see that the two big issues, particularly since 1949, that have dominated the economy are modernization and improving living standards. Okay? Another reading that I put on your reading list is Susan Shirk, and she also is a very good example of looking at the sort of contending political influences. And she basically argues that in balancing these, Deng Xiaoping adopted a much more sort of cautious approach than the then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. So in a sense, the Chinese approach was quite balanced, quite incremental, whereas under Gorbachev, the Soviet